What's the creepiest urban legend folklore you've ever heard? Plowman. I lived right outside Pittsburgh, as a teenager, in a little, poor, town called Swissvale. The next communities over are Rankin and Braddock, which are steel production heyday ghost towns that have been plagued with poverty. A strip of woods, lined by a train track, follow the river upon which our communities reside. Right next to the river looms the decrepit abandoned steel mill I believe once called Carey Furnace. As teenagers do, my friends and I used to cut through the park, across the tracks, and to the river to drink, smoke pots, and hang out. Eventually, we started exploring the steel mill. I loved it. The graffiti and sculptural artists, the wildlife that randomly took over, the bums who made it home, etc. all made it a worthwhile adventure. I became comfortable there. Then my friends told me about an abduction and rape of a teenager who's naked and bloodied. Body ended up strung up on a set of city steps. The killer was an insane man who dressed as a clown with a horrid, blood-stained mask. He lives in the woods and in the steel mill. He walks the tracks with a butcher knife he hasn't even bothered to clean. Don't come here alone. I got into a fight with a boyfriend one night and stubbornly decided to walk alone from the river, across the tracks, and through the woods. I got to the tracks, turned and looked at the steel mill. Further down the tracks I saw a figure. I couldn't see a face, but the baggy pants were rather clown-like. I ran like you wouldn't fucking believe. I've never felt fear like that before. It was probably a bum. But who takes chances with an urban legend like that? In San Antonio, there was a school bus which broke down on a set of train tracks. After getting stuck there, a train immediately barreled down the tracks, and before any of the children could get out of the bus, the train and bus collided and tragically killed all on board. It was such a tragedy that they eventually named all of the nearby streets after these children. So, as you drive past a mental institute, on roads named after dead children, you come to a hill. On this hill is where the road meets the train tracks. You park on the tracks and put your car into neutral. For an added effect, you can put white powder on your bumper. Then, you wait. After a little bit, your car randomly starts moving by itself off of the tracks. It's even more odd, because your car doesn't go down the hill, but instead it goes up the hill. If you put white powder on your bumper, you go and look to find tiny fingerprints. Supposedly, those prints are proof of the reason why your car moved by itself off of the tracks. It's because the ghosts of the children who died in the wreck those years ago are what pushed you off of the tracks to save your car and your life from being hit by a train like they were. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty bad. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was a lot younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, whatever. Since it was late summer early fall, it wasn't even approaching dark yet. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small-town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. This guy looked like he was out of the 40s and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being super hot out. But maybe that was the only clothing he had. So the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. Teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. Teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tried talking to the guy, just trying to make simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy just tips up his hat, looks out the window, and says, "Stop the car, now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend a possibly crazy man. The guy stands on the side of the road for a second and then at a dead sprint just runs off into the field beside the road until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. Granted, the crop was fairly tall. He waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the runs or something and didn't want to shit next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about really old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back onto the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merge. But there wasn't a car in sight. What there was the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running, crawling, after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher is beginning to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time his eyes glued on the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to speed and lost sight of the guy in his mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a payphone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her and he had been talking to her coworker about the hitchhiker. When he asks why she would think that, apparently at her office in the town she worked in, one of her coworkers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them. And it is a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with a new girl at work who had to drive home alone at night. Anyways, my teacher assured her that he was not lying, and she evidently believes him and can vouch for her side of the story because she showed up to one of our fundraisers and I asked her about it. So yeah, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. A lot of you are asking where this happened. I don't think he ever actually told us. But for some reason, I'm leaning towards the northwestern part of Montana. At least that's where I pictured it in my mind. Sorry I can't be of further help. He told us this story quite a long time ago. My mum told me this story about the village, where she grew up in Scotland. The village's earliest known settlement is from 3000 BC, so it's old. It's been home to the Picts and the Romans. Nowadays there is a small woodland, and the rest of the surrounding land is farmland. The woods used to be much larger, they are what survives of a large forest that almost completely surrounded the village. Legend says the forest was home to witches. When the forest was being cleared for expanding farmland, a lone witch came out of the forest to tell the villagers to stop. She said the trees would not forgive man for their destruction, and if the villagers did not heed her words then all of their land would become infertile. And all the women. Frightened, the villagers agreed, but asked for a small part of the forest. A deal was made that this, and only this, land could be cleared. The witch also said that for every harvest of every crop grown there, 1 sack of produce must be taken to the edge of the forest. This practice was followed for hundreds of years until the villagers abruptly tore down much of the remaining forest to grow wheat and build a mill. Again a strange woman came from the forest into the village and threatened the villagers. She said they had broken the promise and would suffer. This time the villagers took the woman and hanged her. Her last words were that the price was now 3 sacks. The man who built the mill was scared, and after the first harvest, he took 3 sacks into the woods. Unlike his neighbors, his crops did not fail and his wife became pregnant. Always he paid the woods their due, and before long he was the richest man in the village and had 3 beautiful, healthy daughters. Unfortunately the man grew greedy and thought he'd no longer pay his 3 sacks. The next morning his youngest daughter went missing. The whole village came to help look for her, but the man asked that his men run the mill as normal so he didn't lose any money. There was soon a commotion at the mill. Some of the workers had fainted, others were crying, some were shouting. The man came to see what was happening. A horrified worker told him they had started up the mill as normal, but blood had poured from between the stones. They had found his missing daughter. Distraught, the man sold his land and fled the village with his family. The mill was torn down, and years later a silo was built there. By the 1960s the silo was ancient and crumbling. It was also rumored to be haunted either by the farmer, his daughter or the witch. Sometimes all 3. This part is my mum's story. One day she and her friends had a bet to see who could spend a night in the silo. One boy who was always boasting of his bravery volunteered. Between them, my mum and her friends conspired to keep this a secret from their parents by lying about camping in each other's gardens. That evening the boy, John, climbed the silo loft and mum and her friend gave him a bag of food, a blanket and a torch. They told him they'd be back in the morning, but were actually planning on coming back later to frighten him. They had waited a few hours and snuck back to the silo, and alarmingly they could hear John sobbing and crying for help. They found him quite away from the silo, pulling himself along on his stomach. John had jumped out the silo loft and broken his ankles. He was carried back to his parents' house and taken to hospital. After the inevitable week of punishment, my mum was allowed to visit John. She said he still looked as terrified then as he had that night. She asked him what happened. He said he told his parents and the doctors that he fell, but the truth was he saw something. Not long after he was left on his own he could hear something shuffling around in the loft. He used the torch to see, but there was only empty grain bags. He tried to ignore the noise, but finally it sounded like it was moving toward him. When he shone the torch on the grain bags again he saw that they were crawling, dragging themselves along the floor towards him. That's why he jumped. The silo's long been demolished, but they've built homes there now. Eek. I live in northern Australia, and everyone growing up in my town knows of the legend of the poinciana woman. A quick Google search will elaborate into the many variations to the story, but the one I grew up to know is that of a woman who was raped by Japanese fishermen who hanged herself from a poinciana tree when she had discovered she was pregnant. She is said to appear as a beautiful woman to entice men, with long dark hair dressed in a white gown, and is said to be situated at our army reserve. When I was around 12 and my younger brother 10, he had been in his room and I was in the lounge room on the computer. He had come barreling out from his room screaming, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" before dragging me over to the window. There was a faint feminine moan hum. We could hear it moving from the window we stood at to the one across the room and back in a clockwise direction. The wind had picked up with the noise despite how still the night had been. The sound became so loud that we were on the floor covering our ears crying. When I've brought it up recently, my brother agrees it was almost as if the sound had been in our heads. This went on for about 10 minutes before abruptly stopping. No wind, nothing. We found out the next day that our older siblings had been at the Army Reserve that night before they got home, had climbed the concrete pillars to the locked gun turret, and had been taunting the poinciana woman before they left when they heard footsteps, assuming it was security. What creeps me out most is that not long after this happened, I realized that we had a poinciana tree outside of that window. So about my 3rd year in Japan, I moved to a small town. I am living way up in the woods north of the little town I work in. It is a narrow winding road with a river on one side and a steep mountain on the other. The road is so narrow that there are places to pull over and wait if another car is coming. On any night I am heading home after work, keeping in mind that if I see a car heading towards me or they have to pull over. I am heading north with the river on my left and mountain on my right. I get to this place that the road curves to the left with a big rock on the left side of the road, right at the curve. I see car lights of a white Taurus-type car to the left of the rock, kind of over the river, coming from the other side, and so I pull over to wait for them to pass. I keep waiting for them to come around the rock, which has a small shrine in it, but they never come. Huh. Weird, but there are a few buildings up there. Maybe they pulled in just as the rock obscured my vision of them. I head home without thinking much about it. Later that night I get the munchies, and the only store was back south in the main part of town. So I am driving south this time, and come to that same corner. And I see the same white car, past a rock shrine, coming north towards me. This time I am by the buildings and I pull over and wait for him to pass. But no car comes. This is really weird because on the north side there are places a car could disappear, but on the south side there is nowhere to go. Only a steep mountain on one side and a river on the other. As around the bend, nothing. No car to be seen. So this sticks with me until one day in October I am teaching a culture lesson about Halloween in the local junior high school. The subject of ghosts comes up, and I jokingly say, "Hey, I think I saw a ghost. Do you know the road that goes north with a shrine in the corner of?" Screams of terror from half the class like total panic, girls are crying, guys are shouting, and the Japanese teacher has gone deadly white. Some are literally in the fetal position moaning stop over and over. I was floored at the reality.